Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with another model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale M48A5 Patton Tank. Now, unlike many of the other smaller and larger scale builds that are showcased on the ESCI channel, where those builds are built for private commission and belong to a private collector, the model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. Now, unlike many of those other commission builds, the model being 1/72nd scale is not a scale that I actively work in, nor is it a scale that I accept commission builds in. Typically, my commission build work ranges from 1/35th scale all the way up to 1/6 scale. Now, for availability and pricing information for commission work in something more along those lines, I can be reached by the email address which is listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Now, this model here is built mostly out of the box. However, I did go ahead and add several scratch build components, bringing up the model to the specs that you see it here. We'll be going over all of these additions and modifications in this video, as well as also reviewing the base starter kit as well. So stay tuned. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the M48A5 Patton. The M48 was really the end of the road of the M48 family with the U.S. military service. Now, the origins of this vehicle date back to, of course, the late 1950s. During the 1950s, the U.S. Army developed and adopted the M48 Patton, and eventually going through its paces with the M48A1, M48A2, and then finally with the M48A3, which is the more noteworthy of the Patton series, as the M48A3 was the main tank which was utilized in the Vietnam War. There were some M48A2s, but realistically the A3 was the de facto U.S. American tank of that theater. Now, although the U.S. military was pretty happy by and large with the M48A3 family, around the same time the Soviet Union had new tanks on development, as well as also entering into production and being fielded, which were going to eclipse the M48's capabilities. The U.S. military saw this and went ahead and developed a new tank design, and of course all of these new features were learned from lessons from the M48. Of course, this vehicle resulted in the M60 tank family. The M60 and its later iterations became the mainstay of the U.S. Armored Corps, and although this vehicle was in widespread production and a large number were produced, the U.S. military still had a large war stock of old M48 and older variants of Pattons still on inventory. With the Vietnam War winding down in the early and mid-1970s, by this point here the M48A3 was beginning to show its age, and its capabilities were considered far inferior compared to the Russian tanks of the same era. It was at this point in the mid-70s where there was an upgrade program that was envisioned to take the remaining surplus stock of M48 Pattons and upgrade them to make them as close to on par with the M60 tank family as possible. These vehicles weren't necessarily going to be used for frontline service. They were going to be more or less used for Army Reserve units as well as Army National Guard. As for the Army's mainstay, again, this would have been relegated for the M60A1. The biggest, most noteworthy change from the earlier iterations to the A5 was the conversion of the main gun. The M48 series was originally armed with a 90mm main gun, and for the upgrade, this was replaced with the same 105mm L7 gun utilized on the M60 family. With the guns being replaced, the tank's fire control equipment also needed to have been upgraded as well. Of course, the units from the M60 were utilized on the M48A5 conversion. Another really big change was a replacement of the vehicle's power pack. The vehicles were modified to utilize the Continental AVDS 1792D V12 diesel engine. Now, this is specifically noteworthy for many of the vehicles which were converted from M48A1 configuration. As we recall, the A1 would have had the original gas engines, and the conversion process is a little bit more complex compared to the A2 or A3s, which utilize a diesel engine system, but were a little bit different compared to the ones found on the 60. With the change to the M60's power pack, this of course simplifies maintenance as well as spare parts usage required to keep one of these vehicles running. Another change was the replacement of the Commander's mini cupola turret and replaced it with the low-profile Israeli-designed Erdan Commander's cupola. What's interesting about the Erdan design was this was very similar to the original M48 Patton cupola that was designed in the early 1950s but was later replaced with the mini turret design. With the new redesigned cupola, the vehicle was armed with an M60D machine gun for both the Commander as well as the loader. Some units would replace this with a standard M2HB, but that was when the vehicle was fielded in places like South Korea. For general use, the M60D was the machine gun of choice on the M48A5. The vehicle also received some slight modifications to the tin work, as well as to the rear engine grills. The other more notable change was the replacement of the original double chevron pattern of track with the non-directional octagonal links utilized on the M60A1 family. By the end of the 1970s, several thousand of the M48s were converted to A5 specifications. These vehicles went on to serve with the U.S. military for about 2 more decades until their final retirement in the early and mid-1990s, which, considering several of these vehicles were produced in the 1950s, is actually pretty incredible. Although the M48A5 is retired with the U.S. military, the vehicle was also widely exported to several other allied countries, and these vehicles are still in service to this date with a large number of them. Another usage of the M48A5 platform was the basis of the Sergeant York Dividad air defense system, but that is something really best left for another video. Before I go any further and mention and describe the features that went into this build, let me go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with, as well as some of the quality of the kit components which needed to be worked upon. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage plastic M48A5 kit from AMT ERTL. Now, this kit here is a little bit misleading because even though it is labeled as an AMT ERTL kit, the model does not utilize any tooling from AMT. In fact, this model here is a rebox of the ESCI 1/72nd scale plastic kit of the M48A5. If anyone is a frequent viewer of the ECA channel, the name ESCI should sound familiar because it has popped up in recent months as I've recently completed 2 of their 1/72nd scale M60A1 builds. Just like with this model here, those kits were also reboxing of their original ESCI tooling. Now, just like I stated in those other videos, back in the late 70s and throughout the 1980s, the Italian plastic model company ESCI was actually very prolific. They released a wide range of 1/72nd scale airplanes as well as plastic AFV model kits. Now, during this period of time, the ESCI kits were considered to be some of the best kits on the market. The detailing that were found molded into the kit components on these models were considered to be better compared to the other contemporaries which were available from the other companies at this time. Now, although ESCI did release the kits under their own branding and box arts, for the US market, I believe that ESCI came to a licensing and distribution agreement with AMT ERTL, where ESCI would supply the kits, and then AMT would rebox them with their own packaging, which is what you see here. Also, if you go online and you try to find these old ESCI kits, it is very common to find these kits under the AMT banner. This is not just true for their 1/72nd scale kits, but also for many of their 1/35th scale kits as well. Now, AMT worked with ESCI all throughout the 1980s and also into the early part of the 1990s. However, at some point, ESCI started to lose business, and so they eventually went defunct and ceased operation. When this happened, ESCI went ahead and sold off all of their tooling to the majority of their kits to Italeri. which is why whenever you find ESCI tooling or ESCI release kits past the 1990s timeframe, you will see them with the Italeri box art and branding, like what was seen in the last two 1/72nd scale M60 builds that I recently posted. However, if you were a kid growing up in the 1990s, chances were really good if you went to a hobby shop to encounter one of these AMT ERTL ESCI reboxes somewhere in their armor stash. The model was acquired off of eBay and has not been in the stash for actually a very long period of time. Starting with the model's box art, here we have the M48A5 undergoing some maneuvers. We have here the classic AMT ERTL logo with their typical typeface. What's interesting, they have to label as a Chrysler. I guess that would make sense for AMT ERTL being predominantly a model car company. Actually, what's interesting is that the M48 series was designed and built by Chrysler Defense, which eventually was sold off to General Dynamics, probably in the late 80s or early 1990s. So again, this does put a date on this kit here. Here's more graphics on. Here we got to see the sample pictures of the built unit. Some of the features that the kit has. And on the back here we have the finished model, which is a sample unit again. Quick history of the M48A5. And it's interesting to point out that when this verbiage was written, the M48A5 was actually still in service with the US military. Popping open the box, let's take the kit out. Here we have attention modelers, a nice little paper insert for a catalog. And you can definitely see how this is dated. Along with AMT ERTL, MPC was another ERTL subsidiary, and they also had a lot of the Star Trek licenses, which if you were interested in a plastic model of the Enterprise or any of the other ships of the Star Trek series, AMT was basically your go-to for the kits. With the Star Trek stuff out of the side, takes us to the kit itself. You notice that all of the kit components are sealed in this little bag that we have here. Obviously, they are made in Italy because it is a ESCI kit. Opening up the bag, strewn the parts on the table. Now again, if anyone saw the M60 video, these parts here should look very, very reminiscent of that kit. Starting with the lower hull, here you can see all of the detailing found on the tooling. It is a one-piece lower hull, just like the M60. From the lower brings us to the upper. Here you get to see all of the molding and detailing. And again, for the time period of being the 1980s, something like this is very nicely done. Moving our way down, takes us to the turret. First, the top portion of the turret. It does have some cast texturing present, although it's very, very faint, and more than likely after a couple coats of paint, you're not exactly going to see it, but it is there. It's funny, as some of the design cues of the way the kit is broken down look very similar to the Tamiya 1/35 scale M48 Patton, but obviously the two companies are not connected to each other in any way. Here we have the bottom piece. I will say that on this kit, it's slightly more improved compared to the M60, a one that they did, in that on the M60, it's missing this little inlet, which is found here on the back portion of the turret to make clearance for the driver's hatch. But on the M48 kit, the divot is there. We also have a two-piece travel lock, which is a nice touch. And some other hull and turret fittings. Now, one thing about the ESCI kits is that they are Lincoln length type track assembly. As we know, I am far being a fan of this material, and generally something like this would be the final straw and a deal breaker for me to work on one of these models. However, having said that, for the ESCI 1/72nd scale models, the Lincoln length are doable, and I was able to have some pretty good results with my last two builds. With the way the tracks are designed, it seems to be the exact same type of assembly, so I should be able to put these tracks together in a short period of time. As for the actual detailing, you'll notice that these are the standard Patton chevron type tracks, which is interesting because on their M60A1 they have the octagonal link, and on their M48A5, which theoretically should have the octagonal track, the chevron pattern is still here. From the turret runner takes us to the main hull runner and the running gear. Take him off for now. Just like with the M60, the road wheels are a single piece type assembly, and the torsion bars are integrally molded to the components. The sprockets are also very similar. They are missing their little guide tooth little channel, which is a feature found on the M48 and M60 series. The detailing found on the parts are, again, they would be considered, I guess, to be soft for modern tooling, but again, for the scope and period that these kits were made in, this is actually pretty good. And these wheels will be used on this model as is. I believe there is an aftermarket resin upgrade set for these components here. However, I'm not going to be utilizing them for this build. One final note back on the track, you notice that on the inside portion, there are no guide horns of any sort, and the track faces are totally flat. This may be a concern to people who are expecting a little bit more detailing, as something like this, I believe, is present on more contemporary model kits. Here goes the rear bustle rack. Some portion of the Searchlight. What's actually nice about the Searchlight is that unlike the version on the M60, where it was just totally simplistic, on the 48 they actually went ahead and molded in the little grab handles that we have here and here. That's actually a nice touch, and in fact is something that I had to scratch build on my last M60A1 build. Nice to see that's not going to be a problem for this model here. Here goes the rear plate with the distinctive Patton rear grillwork. And then finally, the last runner is a bit that is exclusively for the M48A5, which would include the Erdan low-profile cupola, the 105mm gun, as well as the improved air filtration system. We also have here a small little M60D machine gun mounted on the pintle, which would be present for this vehicle. The last thing are the instructions. Very, very simple, and I guess cheaply printed, but they get the job done. Pretty straightforward with how to assemble one of these kits. And again, the model should make for a nice, simplistic, quick build. And here's the model now fully assembled and is about to go off into painting. Now, I wanted to take a minute to go and describe the way I assemble the Caterpillar tracks. With, again, this pattern of kit with the Lincoln Length style tracks, these can be a hurdle for most modelers to put together. Now, while working on these ESCI kits, I came up with a way to do the tracks which makes the build a lot easier for not only construction, but also for painting. Now, as you can see, the model is completely assembled. However, looks can be deceiving. Let me go ahead and take the model apart so I could go and show exactly how these track sections are assembled. Now here you can see exactly how I did it. The way I assemble the tracks on these ESCI kits is that I take the wheels and I put them into their locations on the lower hull, but I do not glue them in place, not at the moment. When the hull is assembled, I prop it up in a vertical format, and I then take the wheels off the runner and put them into their appropriate locations. Now, with these ESCI kits, the wheels and the swing arms are integrally molded to each other, so the piece just simply slides directly in place where it needs to go. It is at that point there where I take the track sections which on the ESCI kit are in a segment in length, I then remove it from the runner and glue it to the bottom portion of the wheels. Once I let the glues fully set, the wheels are now attached to the track, and this allows me then to go ahead and start assembling the remainder of the track work. I kind of got this idea from the 1/72nd scale Tiger model design M1A2 Tusk build that I did a little while ago. On that build, the wheels and the top and bottom segments of the track were integrally molded together, and then you need to just glue the front and rear portions plus a few loose links around the curved areas. With this type of design, you accomplish the exact same benefits of that type of a tooling. By going with this route, the advantages are that the assembly goes by fairly quickly, and with this type of design, this allows much better ease for painting. If the tracks were permanently assembled to the lower hull, trying to get access with the paint for not just the tracks, but also for the row wheels and the under portions here of the lower hull is a little bit more difficult due to the tight confines of all the parts fully assembled. With this type of a format here, I can thoroughly paint all of the components, and I have a much better way to get access to all of these locations, ensuring that paint thoroughly gets on all of these parts, leaving for a nice, better appearance, as opposed to having areas which are commonly left in the plastic due to paint being missed in these locations. Now, the one drawback that this system does have is that the pieces are on the Now, one drawback that this type of layout has is that these pieces here are on the frail and are very fragile. They are very susceptible to being torqued or bent, as well as broken on certain key locations. So utmost care is going to be exhibited by the builder during this phase. Now, of course, once everything is painted and weathered, it's then time for final assembly, and the units then get permanently affixed to their appropriate locations. Once this is done, the tracks are no longer nearly as fragile as they are at this point here. While I have the tracks off, another thing to point out at the model at this point has to do with this rear section over here. If you notice, the area on top of the final drives is this gray coloring. The reason for that is one thing I noticed about the ESCI M48 kit is that when you glue the upper and lower hull halves together, you are going to have a quite substantial gap in this location right above the final drive. Now, of course, this is something that is not present on the real vehicle and was something that I needed to address. The fix was fairly simple and quick. What I did was I took some of my two-part epoxy and I went ahead and inserted it from the inside to the location where it needed to have been. Once the epoxy was in place, I sculpted it roughly to the shape of what the lower hull would have been like and just let it set at that point. By doing this, this plugs up the gap and really helps the accuracy of the model. Now, I gotta point out that once the track and the sprocket are installed to this location here, it's not very visible, but is one of those things that is there, and it did bug me, so I went ahead and addressed it. Starting with the model suspension, like I showcased earlier, the running gear and the track were all pre-assembled in a pontoon style format, and then everything was assembled in one sub-assembly after the model was painted and weathered. This does really speed up and simplify the construction of these older ESCI kits, as well as I could see the same technique working on other 1/72nd scale Lincoln length type vehicles. Now, the tracks themselves are the standard M48 double chevron type links, and these tracks are supplied with all of the ESCI M48 series of kits that are on the market. Now, I believe that when the M48 got its A5 upgrade, I seen many that were also upgraded with the non-directional octagonal links, which were borrowed, of course, from the M60 series. However, knowing the military's bureaucracy as they are, I wouldn't be surprised if several of these vehicles were still equipped with the original tracks that we have here. However, if anyone wants to build a model a little bit more accurately with the octagonal tracks, this is actually doable. However, you're going to need to do a swap with another kit. Like I've showcased on the channel in the past, ESCI also created in the same scale an M60A1 vehicle. Now, the M60 that vehicle represents utilizes the octagonal tracks. So because the vehicles are both 1/72nd scale and both have the basic same length of tracks, it's definitely conceivable that you could just simply swap out the two runners on the two kits, build this guy here with the octagonal link, and build the ESCI M60A1 with the double chevron type pattern, which would be more accurate for an M60A1 that the ESCI kit does represent. Finally, the last thing to point out on the track are the way these tracks are painted and weathered. A lot of people like to over-weather the tracks with the type of rust that is on them. Keep in mind, on the real Patton tracks, the majority of the link is actually comprised of rubber. The two pads on the front here would be rubber, as well as the two sections on either side of what would be a guide horn on the inside portion of the track as well. It's only the end connectors and the center guide horns, which would be bare metal, and these would be where you would add the rusting material if you're making your tank representing of a more beaten up and worn vehicle. However, if you're building your model as a relatively clean example with minimum weathering, it would probably be best to just paint the metal components with a different shade of either a very dark gray or of a different type of black as opposed to the rubber threads, since you want to differentiate between what parts are metal and what parts are rubber, as even when the tracks were new, there were definite color differences between the two types of material. Now, from the running gear brings us to the lower hull. The lower hull was just like on the M60A1, where we have the rear plate affixed to the rear portion of the bathtub hull. Now, just like on the 1/35th scale counterparts of the M48, this model was no different with the seam line, which would have been found in this section over here. Obviously, this needs to be removed in order to make your model a lot more presentable compared to having a nice unsightly seam line running along this section. Now, one advantage that both the M60 and the M48 have is that on the real tanks, the hull is, of course, made from a single casting, and cast texturing is present. To blend in the seam work, this was done with basic red putty. After a couple layers and a little bit of fine sanding, the unit completely blends in. Now, in addition to the removal of the missing sections in the rear, the only other bodywork to mention is on the front section over here, because again of the way the two upper hulls meet, you're going to have a small little line right here on the front of the frog's nose, and with a little bit of super glue and some sandpaper, the seam is easily contended with. From the frog nose brings us to the front fenders. Now, this was one area where is an inaccuracy for an M48A5. From the M48A5 examples I've seen, the fender patterns were slightly redesigned compared to this type of pattern that is more present on the versions of the M48 that came before the A5 configuration. On vehicles with the A5 configuration, the pressings were slightly different, and they're noticeable by having an X stamped into these two sections over here, in lieu of this external brace, which is common again on the older versions of the M48. Now, if you're building this model and you want to improve the accuracy, you could possibly fasten this out of a small, thin piece of sheet styrene, and it'll probably really help the look of it. This is also true for the remainder of the tin work as well, as the M48A5's tin work was slightly different compared to the A2 and the A3 for the Patton. However, for the model here, I just left that stock as it wasn't something that I really wanted to go into with extra fabrication, specifically on a model of this scale. But again, if anyone is a real stickler for detailing, I recommend going the extra route and doing a little bit of fabrication work on your own just to kick up the fender work. Now, moving from the fenders brings us to the next modification that needs to be made to an A5, and is actually one that I did do, and that has to do with the bow headlight clusters. Now, the headlight clusters on this model here are correct for an A5. One of the modifications was the M48, A3, and A2's headlight cluster were a lot more complicated compared to the ones found on the later M60. And for a way to standardize parts, they went ahead and changed out this system and recycled the headlights from the M60 and the M60A1. By doing this, the brush guards also had to have been revised. Now, the ESCI kit does supply you with the M60 pattern of headlights, and they're nicely detailed out of the box. However, what is absent are the actual brush guards. Now, the brush guards on this model here are fabricated out of thin strips of aluminum. They were cut, bent into the shape, and then fitted to the model. Now, the headlight locations on the kit itself are also a bit ambiguous. I believe that the ESCI M48A2 kit utilized the correct pattern of headlights, and because of which there are indentations found on the upper hull moldings, which don't make sense if you try to install these pattern of headlights here. So I had to adjust them to the way it would be more represented on an M48A5. Once this slight little alteration is made, it greatly helps the look of the model compared to leaving the headlights totally exposed without any type of brush guards whatsoever. And like I said with the track, I'm telling you it's a little weird, but I wouldn't be surprised that there may have been one or two M48s that slipped through the A5 configuration where they swapped out the headlights but didn't alter the tin work. Specifically on vehicles that would have possibly been in Army Reserve or National Guard inventories. However, this of course is purely speculation, and don't harp on me too much on that. It's just a gut feeling that I have. From the bow headlights brings us to the remaining details here on the front, starting with the fire extinguisher handle. This was the stock unit. A little swipe of red paint was added, as this would be seen on vehicles of this era. The periscopes are molded in, they're nicely done, and a swipe of gloss black paint are all that were added to make them pop. On the side here we have the exhaust for the heater, and again, detailing is again out of the box. I just weathered it appropriately for an exhaust pipe. From the front brings us to the rear, and really nothing was added to this section here. What you see is basically what was supplied with out of the box. Now I do want to mention again with the fender work that I believe on the rear fenders as well on the A5 there would have been those X stampings found in these two locations. The other components are again just all stock. Of course I painted the taillights because this is just again another way to help make the model stick out from just leaving everything oversprayed. Now, moving our way to the air filters. The air filter boxes are the kit originals. However, on one of the units, I had a mistake made when I was removing some of the flash found on the component where it makes contact with the runner. I was a little overzealous with my X-Acto knife, and I put a nice gouge right into this panel over here on one of these units. Now, I could have fixed it with a little bit of body work. It would just made me a little bit more of a grumpier person, but luckily I had a spare set of these two air filters on hand from one of the previous ESCI M60A1 builds. That kit does give you these exact same components, but they're an option for use on that kit. This is why it's good to keep spare parts on hand, because I just took the piece out of the spare bin and dropped it directly in place here, and it was a perfect match. From the hull now brings us to the turret. Now the turret on this model here, I found the quality of the tooling to be a little bit smoother compared to the version on the M60A1. The turret has required way less fiddling and hand fitting in order to polish it into the completed state that you see it here. Now, like I said in the unboxing, the turret itself is very reminiscent to the Tamiya 1/35 scale kit, and this is also true with the mantlet as well. The gun mantlet is designed to pivot up and down, but on this model here it's not going to be the case because of the searchlight, which I'll be going over in a second. The remainder of the detailing is all stock, which would include the range-finding blisters on the side portions of the turret, as well as the handrails that we have here. The bin on this model here is way easier to put together compared to the one on the M60A1. On that kit, the bin was comprised of three very small and frail components that you have to carefully trim off of the sprue and assemble in order to get it fitted to the model. On the M48 series, the unit is one complete molding. Now, one side effect to this is that the bottom portion is solid and doesn't have its little rib work, which of course would be found on the actual grill. You'll also see there's no PE added to this model because, again, of the scale. Now I know there's small scale photo etch mesh out there, but again, I'll leave that for someone who's a more die-hard braille scale aficionado to play with it on its own. For this model here, the piece without the PE is perfectly suffice for my needs. Moving from the bin takes us to the Jerrican, again stock with the unit, and the unit is again nicely detailed again for the 1/72nd scale that we see here. If you'll notice the way I painted the Jerrican, we have the can itself in olive drab, the holder is of course the same color of the tank, and the strap is this light olive green color, which is typical for webbing of this period. Now from the Jerrican now takes us to the tow cable hookups that are on the rear section here of the turret. One of the key details found on these Patton vehicles, again, are the tow cable assemblies. Just like with the M60A1, these pieces were missing off of the molding and needed to have been fabricated. Now, for a model this scale, I went ahead and fabricated these out of flat strips of floor wire that were cut very, very thin and bent to the shapes of the tow cable clamps, as well as the U-hooks, which are the guides for the cables themselves. From the rear turret now brings us to the front. Now, one feature that this model has, being an A5, is the correct 105mm gun barrel. And this just plugs directly into the standard 90mm mantlet without any problems. Now, mounted directly above the gun is the Xenon Searchlight. The Xenon Searchlight is more evolved than the version found on the ESCI M60A1. On this model here, the piece is better detailed with both some minor little strap detailing found on the top and bottom, and you also have the molded in handles, which were nicely detailed. Unfortunately, during construction, I had a mishap with the handles and they broke on me. So the handles on this model here are fabricated out of very thin pieces of wire, ironically in the same manner as I did it on the M60A1 build, so I kind of had practice with doing it. Now, just like with the M60A1, on the inside portion of the Xenon Searchlight, there is absolutely no detailing whatsoever. It is just a big empty box, and there's also no lens. The light emitting section that we have here is again made from a chunk of sprue that was cleaned up, carved into the relative shape of the light emitting object, and affixed to the inside portion of the unit. On the outside, we're topped off with a clear piece of styrene, which mimics the lens that's found on the outer portion of these searchlights. The way the unit's painted is also like the way I mentioned in my 1/35th scale M60 and M103 series as well, where on the inside, the walls are actually a gloss black coloring, and the only part that's silver is the rear section, which is the reflector for the light. On the exterior, you notice that I painted the searchlight with a different color compared to the rest of the vehicle. Again, like I mentioned in those videos, this helps give the model a little bit of differentiation, makes it pop, and also it's something that would not be uncommon on real vehicles because the Xenon Searchlight was something that was not a permanent piece of the vehicle and can be unplugged, stowed, and mounted almost at a whim. Now on the rear section here of the Searchlight, we have the power cord. This was fabricated out of a piece of thin floor wire and was just bent and mounted into shape and was mounted to the socket that is found on the top portion of these Pattons. The socket was molded in, but was carefully drilled out in order to have the wire plugged directly into the turret, giving for a nice strong mounting. Now, one thing I noticed about these kits is that even with the Searchlight fitted, your gun elevation is definitely going to be dampered. And you're not going to be able to elevate the gun too much with its stock configuration. Now, if I was to build the model again, I'd probably do some modifications to this rear section here of the mantlet, which would give me a little bit more clearance to have the gun raise in a more elevated manner. But again, for this build, it's the way you see it is perfectly fine for me. Moving further takes us to the Erdan Commander's Cupola, which is a staple on these M48A5s. This was built out of the box with no mods necessary. Now, what's interesting is that the piece actually can pivot just like the mini turret cupolas found on the earlier M48s, but on the Erdan it would have been mounted in the way you see it here. The antennas, of course, were also added. These were just pieces of floor wire which were drilled carefully into the turret casting. The last thing to mention, detail-wise, is the M60D machine gun, which is fitted on this pintle mount, which would be integrally casted to the Erdan. The M60D is a somewhat decent rendered piece, again for 1/72nd scale, and also the gun being about 30 years old. The unit was a little tricky getting fitted on. There's a small little molded-in peg which would mount to a corresponding section here found on the pintle mount, but I found this method to be a little problematic, and if you try to insert the peg in, you're just going to snap the pintle mount because the molding is very small and the peg is a bit too big for that point. So I just simply amputated the peg off and hard mounted the unit directly to it. Now for the M60, on the D variant, there are 2 spade grips in the back, and that replaces the buttstock and pistol grip found on the standard M60 machine gun. On the model here, with a swipe of gloss black paint, I just painted these 2 little stripes to indicate the 2 spade grips, which on the real gun would be made from a polymer material. Well, that wraps up the detail aspect of this build, and now that segues us into the paint and the markings. Now, with the model being an M48A5, this would be very appropriate, in my opinion, to have with some kind of a Merc camouflage scheme. They just go well on these A5s. The Merc scheme, for those who don't know, are a standardized template of camouflage for a number of vehicles around this period. It allows you to change 1 or 2 colors, which would custom camouflage the vehicle for any given circumstance, be it winter verdant, fall, jungle, tropics, and of course this model here is the desert camouflage scheme. Oddly enough, it's basically the same camouflage which was seen on the box art. And as a side note, there's a really nice example of a M48A5 with a camouflage pattern basically very similar to this in the AAF Tank Museum. And if you ever see that tank, it's awesome with the amount of wear and weathering on it. Honestly, I hope they never repaint it because it looks completely dope the way it is. This model here, I basically went with a similar type of mindset with in terms of the weathering. I wanted to have this model to be a little bit more well-worn compared to my usual type builds. And you can see that with the level of dry brushing and sun fading on this model. Now, for the actual camouflage, this model was painted via a paintbrush as opposed with my usual airbrush method for adding camouflage. The reason why I went with the paintbrush was really twofold. First, with the scale that this model is, if I tried to use an airbrush, I would be unable to appropriately get the blotches in their appropriate locations with that method. And also, it would be too hazy and it wouldn't have these nice crisp edges that you see here. Now, the Merc patterns were applied in basically 2 ways. So you had some crews who would apply them via a spray gun, if available, or if there was no spray equipment available, they would just be given a bunch of paintbrushes and apply the pattern with that type of a method. So if anyone is working on any sort of a Merc camouflaged vehicle, you have 2 options to use. And I've even seen some where some utilize blotches that are spray gun, and the little camouflage little stripes that we have here are done with a paintbrush, or vice versa. It really has a lot of depth to it, and if you're a builder, you can have a lot of fun with it. Now, as for the actual camouflage layout, this is pretty standardized, believe it or not. There were several paint-by-number color templates which were issued for literally any vehicle you could think of, from an M151 Mutt to an M60 bridge layer. And the M48 was no different. Now, for the blotch layout you see here, this was directly taken off of the actual government templates for applying the Merc scheme. Like I've mentioned in a few other Merc painted vehicles that I've done, there is a website which has all of the actual templates available for free download, where you can find the vehicle you're working on and get a good template on where the colors go. In addition to that, they also have a nice color chart where you could custom match your paint to make it look just like the real deal. That information is found on the website listed below, and it's also in the video description, and I can't stress this enough. It is a fantastic source for anybody who's working on a Merc painted vehicle. Now, with the camouflage out of the way, the markings that you see on this model are decals. However, they are not the decals which were originally supplied with the model. The reason for that is not necessarily because of the quality, it's because, frankly, I lost them during the course of the build. They fell somewhere and I guess they never turned up. So the markings that you see on this model are actually newer markings which were borrowed again from one of the other ESCI M60A1 builds. One of those builds was the all Olive Drab One, and if we recall from that model, there are two options for markings. We have the one with the white stars and the version with the black stars for use on the master paint scheme. Because I did one with the white stars, I had the other ones on hand, and those are the markings that you see on this vehicle. They went on without any problems and are a really nice fit for this vehicle, in my opinion. Moving along to skill level and recommendation, because of the model's small scale, combined with the smaller components that need to be fitted to this build, I cannot recommend this to a beginner. This is also true again for the link and length tracks that this model has. A person who's a beginner is definitely going to run into problems and difficulties in trying to get the suspension basically assembled and installed in a nice clean manner. Something like this would be best done for someone who's had several other builds under his belt and can then level up and tackle something along these lines. Now, the out-of-the-box kit does build very well in my opinion. However, being an older kit, you do have to do a little bit more hand fitting on a couple other components compared to what people are expected on the new, more current kits that are on the market. Now, this kit here is basically on par with the ESCI M60A1. Both of these kits do require almost the exact same type of hand fitting in certain locations, as well as also the level of extra scratch building required to kick the models up to the next level. Now, one thing that's really neat is that on the M48 kit, ESCI released this model in 3 different formats, I believe. One version, of course, is the M48A5. The other was the M48A2, and in that version, there was another option to make the vehicle with an Israeli type configuration. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, ESCI also had an option to build the model as a Bundeswehr rendition of the M48 as well. And on that note, that now transitions us to recommendations. Just like with the M60A1, the same type of person who enjoyed that build would enjoy one of these kits as well. This would include anyone who's a surefire Patna Holic, as well as anyone who is an avid fan of post-World War II and Cold War era vehicles. This model here is perfect for wargaming, as well as miniature small-scale dioramas. With the subject matter being what it is, you can easily have this vehicle as well as the ESCI M60A1s together in a nice little diorama scene. Now, although the kit is a bit dated compared to, again, the type of tooling that one would expect for kits of today, the model, in my opinion, still builds up into a nice rendition of the M48A5. Now, if anyone is an advanced builder, you can probably kick it up to a further level than even I've done over here. As, like I mentioned in the video, there are certain aspects of the M48A5 that were missing off of this model here, and to add them would need some assistance with some scratch building. There is also, I believe, an aftermarket photo etch and resin set available for this exact same kit, which further enhances it again from the configuration that you see it here. If someone is a diehard 1/72 scale fan and really wants to polish one of these up even further, it might be good looking into. Now, one drawback that this kit does have may be availability. I'm not sure if Italeri ever released the M48A5 kit in this configuration. I know that Italeri does have the rights for the tooling for the ESCI M48s because in the past they did offer the American version of the M48A2 as well as also the Israeli counterpart with, of course, the different markings. However, I've yet to see this A5 version be released. So this model here may be something that you're going to have to track down either, again, on eBay, or possibly you might find one at a model show or, again, tucked away in a stash in some hole-in-the-wall hobby shop in your local area. However, I will say that if you're up to it, this kit here might be worth your while. And in the end of the day, me personally, I really like the way this build turned out. This was one of those kits that was really more common back in my youth, and was one that I typically avoided for one reason or another, namely due to the smaller scale being 1/72, and of course the dreaded link and length track. However, now that I got this one in the bag, it feels really good to have another notch in my belt, and to have another nice little vehicle added to my collection. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale M48A5 Patton Tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, be it model showcase videos like this guy over here, or the 1/6 scale project update videos when they get posted. Another way to stay in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. On the ECA Facebook page, there are photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on the channel throughout the years. Finally, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks for watching.